It's Mark and Pete.
Hello and welcome to the show. More colourful conversations with Mark and Pete. Welcome, and this particular episode is Does Freedom of Speech Exist? Now, freedom of speech is something which is an emotive subject, and one which we will debate in a lot of detail, covering ideas and opinions which is most precious to the rights of man. Every citizen, it might be agreed, is open to the idea of having a freedom to speak, to write, to print with freedom, and possibly to even be responsible for their own actions when one actually communicates to a wide audience, or even directly to one individual. And it's often seen as a freedom as defined by law. But, with that said, do we really have the right to uphold opinions without interference and say what we really think? So with me today is Pete. So Pete, what's your opinions on freedom of speech?
Well, I think that freedom of speech is important. It's one of those things that you grow up with within Western culture, and having brought up in Britain, it's something I've got used to. The idea that you have freedom of speech. This is a free country, we say, when people question what you're saying. It's a free country, isn't it? But I think that there are limits that are put on, some rightly, some wrongly, by people in authority, limits of speech of what you can say. And it's not just what you can say in polite company, but what you can simply say. So there are limits put on it. And some of those things are right and some of them are wrong. This is, in my mind, this is where it divides. If you are saying something that is not true, the facts are otherwise, it's widely accepted that what you're saying is simply false, and you're broadcasting, you're deliberately trying to give a false impression about something which is a big event, or it's important, or maybe it's something that is part of the culture in which you are, and it's been shown that your take on it is false. You're giving incorrect information, and I think you should be stopped from saying it, or at least from broadcasting it. Not stopped from thinking it.
Yes.
I think that's the distinction I make. You can think what you like, but you can only say things that that are true in that they haven't been demonstrably proven to be false. Yes. So, but when it comes to opinion, that's where I think it gets sticky, and it's quite a difficult situation in trying to say, well, what opinions then can we say? Because we don't know whether they're true or not. So, well, I'm quite clear about not saying things that are demonstrably false that will have an effect. Talking about big things in society, or even telling lies about someone else, which breaks one of the 10 Commandments. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. So it's clearly wrong to just go around telling falsehoods about other people. But when it comes to your opinion about them, well, it's a bit more of a slippery scale of whether it's right and wrong.
Yes. Well, interestingly, you mentioned something there about what one thinks and what one says. And I think that that's a very important point. And I would just sort of like to set up my view on this. So I've got a little poem here, which is entitled, Oops. I had a lovely thought today. It prowled around my head. Subconsciously, it escaped my mouth, and words began to spread. They manifested into ideology, a free expression for world solution. Now the tongue's unleashed the devil's wrath and caused a bloody revolution. Yours, apologetically, Big Mouth. So, if you think about what you said there, which I think was a valid point, that many people will have opinions. Everybody forms opinions about politics, religion, about possibly even something that happens at work. I mean, particularly in the working environment, everybody has opinions. You might conform to certain standards and procedures, but at the end of the day, we all run our society about opinions. But at the same time, we have to think about consequence. So when one delivers a form of communications, whether that's verbally. And of course, in today's society, we've got social media. As we've seen in recent times, people have often been heavily criticized for putting out commentary without really thinking about the consequence. So I think consequence is something which is critical, because that really then basically means that we don't really have true freedom of speech to say literally what we want.
Yeah, well, I think that's fair enough, in that in everyday society, just in your everyday life, you know that you can't say just anything. And in fact, if you just think about specific people who you wouldn't say the same things to as to other people, like small children, for example, you don't speak in the same way, you don't say the same things, you don't reveal the same truths to little children as you do to adults. And you can be more nuanced with other people. You don't say the same things to everyone. In certain situations, you speak differently. And this is accepted practice. And so I think if you ramp up the importance of it, that's a sort of an everyday example of things that maybe aren't so important, just being polite or just being aware of someone's age. But if you ramp up the importance and and look at public declarations or people publishing their views, and whether they should say these things or not, you can see that it's still reasonable for people to say some things you cannot say. Yeah. However, the problem here is who gets to say what's okay to say and not. And there, you leave yourself open to an abuse of power, don't you? As soon as you're saying, well, certain things cannot be said, the question then remains, who's going to decide what to be said?
Well, it's interesting that, of course, in recent times, we've had many laws, and each country does have laws which tends to restrict what one can say. So, for example, we have laws around libel, slander, obscenity and pornography and many other key subjects. And in fact, as we know that from what was said, certainly in the 20th century, it led to the First and even Second World War. In fact, just after the Second World War, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. And it was interesting that the declaration arose directly from the experience of the Second World War and represents the first global expression of rights to which all human beings are inherently entitled. So it was a mark really basically saying that people do have constraints, but they should in theory have a right to speak.
There is also the question of the different people who are saying whatever it is. And freedom of speech, where it is important and where that Declaration of Human Rights comes in, is that everyone has the right to speak. Everyone has the same right.
Yeah.
When I argued that you shouldn't be able to spread around deliberate falsehoods in order to mislead people, then I think that you shouldn't be able to do that, but that everyone has the same right. So everyone is stopped from doing that. No one's allowed to do that. And in the same way, everyone has the right to put in their opinion or to spread true information around. So it should be equal. The law, the arrangements for whether you can speak should equally apply to all people, irrespective of their background, irrespective of who they are, so that no one gets preferential treatment. It should be an impartial law.
Yes, well, the interesting thing is that this concept of freedom of speech is not something new, although we typically tend today seeing the media, whether that's the TV, social media or radio, talking about it quite freely, whether politicians or people from various religious groups, etc., having the right to say what they want. But interestingly, it goes back a long way. So, for example, John Milton, who was an English poet, famously for writing the poem Paradise Lost, was also a civil servant for the Commonwealth of England under Oliver Cromwell. And he had a particular view on argument on freedom of speech. And essentially, he broke it down into three distinct aspects. So the right to seek information and ideas, the right to receive information and ideas, and the right to impart information and ideas. Now, his particular view of freedom of expression was grounded in a Protestant view, and he thought that the English people had the mission to work out the truth of the Reformation, which would lead to the entitlement of the people. But he also articulated that the main strands of future discussion were effectively around the scope of freedom of expression of harmful speech, and he argued that the principle of pre-censorship and in favour of tolerance for a wide range of views. Mm-hmm. So it's quite interesting that although we think of it today as a modern concept, this is something that's around for centuries.
Yes. I mean, the Reformation was important in allowing people to have different opinions. And those opinions to which he was referring there, well, he was referring widely, but the initial reference was to interpreting the Bible. And it had become accepted that interpretation of the Bible was the job of the officials in the church.
Yes.
Whereas the new way of thinking after the Reformation was generally, for most of the reformers, that the interpretation of the Bible was opened up to people, who, yes, were making a careful study of it, but was opened up to people everywhere to read and to interpret. Now, some Protestant thinkers returned to the idea of there being a correct interpretation of the Bible, authoritative, interpreted by the church or by certain preachers, I guess, or certain academics. Whereas at the time, what he was talking about then is because the Bible had been translated into the vernacular. The Bible was translated into English at about the time that he was writing. It would have been available in English. And therefore, you could interpret it for yourself. Now, today, it seems that when you're talking about freedom of speech, we forget that a lot of those, of this coming of people being free to speak came from the Reformation in rebelling against the control of the Bible by the church and by the king or queen of the time, and freeing up the people to study the Word of God for themselves. And because they then had the Word of God, they had the Bible, they had access to the Scriptures who could give them their rule of life, they themselves, the people, could govern themselves. And that's where the American Bill of Rights, where it's all based on, the Declaration of Independence refers to it, that people could govern themselves. They could be the governance of the people by the people. And yes, that phrase, of the people by the people, actually originally comes from Wycliffe, who translated the Bible into English all those centuries ago. That's where it comes from. So I do think that this idea of freedom of speech the point you were making was this idea has been around for some time, certainly since the Reformation. And I think it's a Christian idea that comes from this Christian Reformation, the Reformation being the reforming of the Christian church in line with biblical teaching. Perhaps now is a good time just to finish off what I was just saying there, that if you actually look in the Bible, you do see some things said that can be helpful to our discussion here about freedom of speech. The first reference is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. And this is instructions to Christians on how they are to speak. So it says this: let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them. So they're not talking about whether things are true or not. That they should be true is here assumed. Elsewhere in the Bible it talks about the importance of speaking the truth at all times. What it's saying here is not only that, but they should also be good and helpful. So if it's not helpful, don't say it, is the implication. Yes. And there's an interesting verse from later in the New Testament. This is from Jude chapter 1, and I'm taking it from verse 18, where it says that in the last times, so talking about the times after Jesus' death and resurrection, there will be scoffers whose purpose in life is to satisfy their ungodly desires. These people, it says, are the ones who are creating divisions among you. So this is clear teaching that scoffing, just simply laughing and ridiculing in order to satisfy your own desire, is ungodly. And this is what causes division. So it's talking about people deliberately not just making fun of something to make a point, but laughing at and ridiculing for its own sake, for their own, to satisfy their own desires, is the phrase used. And this is ungodly, so it's seen as being wrong. So the principle is not simply to ridicule for its own sake. That's a wrong thing to do, and it's going to cause division, which we see today.
Yes, and so essentially the idea of satire is one thing, but scoffing is really unacceptable.
Yes, I mean, if you take the prophets of the Old Testament who came up against people from other religions, whole other worldviews, they would use ridicule and satire as one of their main weapons of words, of course. That we're not talking about them physically attacking other people, but of attacking their belief systems with words. One of the things they used was ridicule and satire, and they would set up the people they were arguing against as being people who were saying things that not just simply didn't hold water, but were so far beyond the pale that you laugh at them. And indeed, it says in the Bible, it talks about God laughing them. The prophet Isaiah has God laughing at people who put themselves above him. In other words, have their own way of thinking. They're not serious. So, yes, satire is definitely there in the Bible, recorded for all to see, included by people who are accepted as prophets of God. So satire is approved of. So satirical work, good. Scoffing and outright mockery, bad.
It's interesting that this also applies in business, because the question of satire and certainly open debate and sometimes even pointed debate, it's all about judgment, because there have been many examples where people have openly come out and criticised business strategy, but sometimes openly saying things that are just quite ridiculous. And although it's on a different scale, I think famously of Ratner's speech, where he famously, to a very large group of businessmen, openly said that here, sadly, I won't use the exact words, but he sort of basically expressed the opinions that he was selling rubbish. He didn't use the word rubbish, but it was something around that sort of concept. Now, of course, the consequence to that was such that although that might have seemed very amusing to him, it really undermined something that perhaps a lot of people were thinking was, well, actually, he probably is selling a load of rubbish. Yeah. And of course, what then was something that came through as a result, i.e. consequence, that his judgment to make that kind of sort of flippant remark was actually quite damaging.
Yeah, well, what he was doing then was he was scoffing, he was mocking his customers.
Yes.
Well, that's a bad thing to do, isn't it, as a businessman? Yeah. But he was using mockery. He was ridiculing his customers' taste, and he certainly in that business venture reaped the rewards for his stepping over the line there. And I guess this is something we can explore here, and that you should think about consequences. So what should be the consequences of overstepping the boundary? Well, I think there was a natural consequence. It was entirely right that if he's going to mock his customers, that his customers choose not to buy his products. That's not only a punishment for him, it was a natural consequence of what he said. And perhaps I could point out that in the Bible, what's often talked about as punishment is actually simply a natural consequence of what you do. What's talked about as God's wrath being poured out of people, actually, if you look at it, what's being described is simply a natural consequence of what comes about by the particular sin or wrongdoing, the thing being proscribed in question. Yes. has a certain consequence, and it's simply being pointed out. So, although it is punishment, it's a natural punishment. The nature of the punishment was within what you were already doing. One example would be if you were a member of ancient Israel and you were told not to eat certain meats, for example, the meat of pigs, and you did so, you would have almost certainly, if you'd gone on eating them, have caught ringworm or some other disease as a consequence of you disobeying God, and the wrath of God would have been on you. But the reason he told you not to do it was because God, being aware of ringworm, was telling you not to eat it. And so within certain things you do wrong are the consequences. So I would say that within your actions of stepping over the line of mocking people, there are certain consequences which will come your way, which are natural outcomes. In that case, you talked about Ratner, and in other cases, so if you ridicule someone, you're likely to be ridiculed yourself in return. If you're trying to make out someone to be crazy, people may use the same rhetorical devices on you, and that, to me, it seems entirely fair and just. You're putting your head above the parapet, and so you're lobbing out your opinions. Opinions are going to come back at you. Where it becomes difficult to decide is when you, as in human beings, not God, have to decide what punishments should be put in place for people who, in exercising what appears to be their right of free speech, overstep the bounds and are using cruel mockery. Then what should be done? How is this abuse of freedom to be curtailed?
Well, yes, and at the same time, of course, that applies to people not just in authority, but all citizens throughout the world. So we typically tend to sort of think that perhaps certain authorities have the right to speak their mind, and I immediately sort of think of businessmen and politicians who openly, by the nature of their roles, have to give opinions. But I do agree that there has to be some form of constraint, or at least boundaries, as you say. So you use the term, where do you cross the line? But in legal terms, to define that, for example, if you are to point to an individual, a philosophy, or a thought, or an ideology that you know is going to offend and cause consequence. So in some cases, for example, if you were to say something, there is this principle of slander. If you write something down and you publish in whatever form, in traditional media or in social media, you are libelous, basically. And that means that we, as a point of respect to individuals and groups, we do need to do that. Otherwise, if we literally had an open book where anyone could say anything, there is going to be harm. Going back to Milton's concept, that there has to be some kind of constraint in some way, but at the same time, there has to be tolerance of views, and it's finding that balance.
Yes, I think yes, there is an importance of that balance but in case of holding people to account, I think it does depend on the level of what's been said. For example, if you were, let's give a real example. In the Second World War, people were held as being guilty of incitement to genocide.
Yes.
So in publishing their thoughts, they were inciting people to kill a whole people group. Therefore they were not allowed to say those things or to publish those things. And I think that's been established. That's where the laws of hate speech come from. When a case was upheld in the Nuremberg trial, it was a new law then saying that certain people were inciting, we would say incitement to hatred or to racial hatred, it was an incitement to genocide was what originally brought that case into being. And I think it's easy to mock or ridicule this idea of hate speech.
Yes.
In fact, I find myself doing it because it seems like like something petty. You're just saying something hateful, so it should be against the law. But if you're actually inciting people to kill, then you must be, in some respect, liable for what you've done. You haven't actually killed someone, but you've incited someone to kill. And if we're going to try and keep people safe in society, there must be some sort of curbing of that freedom of expression if you're going to cause people to be killed. But then again, there's another problem in that sometimes things need to be said that are uncomfortable. And so you say, so you're speaking out truth. That truth incited someone to do something violent, but it needed to be said anyway. So it again is a difficult decision. And here's what I think about this. I do think that what's developed in Britain and across what's sometimes called the Anglosphere, countries whose legal systems have developed from the British one, is we have the idea of case law. So the way that you can make sure, or you have some sort of check that this curtailment of the freedom of speech isn't simply being foisted upon you by the government, by those in authority, is by the fact that you have a separate legal system, that the courts aren't controlled by the politicians, and that the law is set, the interpretation of laws that are set by the lawmakers are still open to interpretation by the people. So you say if you're talking about a court in which you have a decision to be made, say about whether someone's caused racial hatred, you have the law. Then how has that law been interpreted in the past? What were the previous judgments? And they set what the interpretation should be. So you have a natural evolution of the law. And
yes,
although this, of course, is in no way without its flaws, it seems to me a bit like that the definition of or the description of democracy that I used in a previous podcast episode. It's the worst form of government apart from all the others. I think that this idea of you having courts that are free from political interference and the interpretation of the law is based on case law, and that's how the law develops, is a terrible system. And it's the worst you could possibly think of apart from all the others, because at least it allows freedom of the courts to interpret when something is really freedom of expression or whether it's, for example, hate speech.
Yes. Well, I mean, we've debated a number of points about the ability to speak your mind, to be able to talk about receiving information, imparting information. And I do agree that essentially that one must have a slightly more open mind on these sort of matters. And I do also agree that there has to be some level of constraint. So it would be interesting to understand the listeners' views on this matter. But I would leave everyone with a little thought, a philosophical thought, which I've sort of described as good advice. Obstinacy is the object of failure that one can ill afford. Open-mindedness is the gateway to opportunity and reward. So with that, join us again next time for more colourful conversations with Mark and Pete.